I've just become obsessed with this statistic that 1 in 3 children have a referral to children's social care by the time they're 16. So I think that's the government saying we are sufficiently worried about something in the life of this child that we're going to step in and try to do something. 1 in 3. I kind of can't get over it. Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Over the summer, we've been taking a close look at the lives of young people and children. And so far in this mini-series, we've looked at everything from the early years through the school years and to the opportunities that are available after the ages of 16. Today, for our final main episode, we're turning to look more broadly at what is happening in the lives of children, and in particular, what is happening in their home lives. And if there's one statistic that's really gripped me this summer, and that I'm telling to everyone who will listen, it's that 30% of children have an interaction with social services before they turn 18. I think we obviously can't hope to answer the question of whether the kids are okay without looking at that broader family life. And actually, the government's own opportunity mission pledges to ensure that every child grows up in a loving home and that families can afford the essentials. But with rising levels of child poverty, increasing material deprivation, and a social care system that is under growing pressures, I think it's a good time to explore how close we are to meeting that ambition. And to unpack all the evidence in these questions, I'm joined by my podcast buddy for this series, Christine Farquharson, who's an Associate Director here at the IFS. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Baroness Anne Longfield, who is Executive Chair and Founder of the Centre for Young Lives and is formerly Children's Commissioner for England. So welcome to both of you.
Pleasure.
Christine, let's start this whole conversation about children's family lives and what's going on at home with what seems like a really obvious question, which is, what do families look like nowadays? What kinds of families are children growing up in?
So I think the first thing to say is what families look like is really, really busy. If you look at some of the time use data that we have, parents are just doing an awful lot more than they used to with their children. On some measures, mothers are spending almost 3 hours a day doing childcare. And if you take a kind of long-term perspective on that, 50 years ago, that was something like 90 minutes. So this is a huge increase. And it's an even bigger increase for dads. Dads are still doing less than mums, but the rate of increase, the rate at which they're starting to do more has been really shocking. That's not just a UK thing. We see that in most high-income countries around the world. But that's been a really big change in what family life looks like. And that means that whereas before we might have thought a lot about what the state provides, what's happening to children outside the home, as well as what are children doing on their own. Now, because of this intensity of time spent with their parents, that home environment is just becoming ever more important.
But can I ask on that, just sorry to interrupt, I mean, I sort of recognise that as a mother of 2 small children, but also, isn't it the case that at least young children are spending more time out of the home in formal settings like nurseries?
Yeah, the youngest ones are. What we're seeing, though, is that when you look slightly older in the age distribution, there's just a lot more hands-on time, or even, chauffeuring the kids around various activities, or making sure that they're getting dropped off on the school run, or sitting there and supervising them, trying to get them to actually do their homework. I think a lot of parents will have felt that particularly during COVID, but this is a kind of longer term intensity of the time that they're spending. And that matters because that also means that the amount of parents' resources, i.e. the amount of parents' time, becomes quite important too. So another big change that we've seen in family life in the UK is that more and more children are growing up in what you might think of as non-traditional family arrangements. If we call traditional family arrangements, you live with biological mum, biological dad, all the way from birth until the time you're 18. Actually, only something like just over half of children born in the 2000s had that experience of living with their 2 biological parents all the way through their childhood. And 20% of firstborn children today are born to parents who are not cohabiting. So I'm not talking about being married here. I'm talking about parents. One in 5 children, their parents aren't living together at the time that they're born. Now, that can be completely the right thing for a child and for a family at whatever stage that comes along. And there's a lot of other factors that go on here in terms of parental conflict or family stress or just relationships that aren't working out well. But what it does mean is when you have only one parent in the home or one parent who's taking on really the bulk of raising that child, you have to start thinking about what's the resource available to that smaller family unit, both in terms of the time that they have available, but also in terms of the money that they have available to be able to spend and provide this kind of material investments that kid is going to need or want.
So Anne, you've obviously been championing the rights and interests of children and young people for a very long time now. And I think everyone sort of intuitively knows that family life is really important. But before we get into the weeds or any of the details, I mean, at a high level, to what extent do you think the problems that some children are facing today are problems that start at home?
Well, family life is absolutely fundamental, if you like. It's what children experience in their, especially earliest days of life and years of life, which we know has a big impact on the rest of their life. When I was Children's Commissioner, one of the statistics that we managed to be able to produce, which was shocking to us at the time, is that 1 in 6 children actually live with families who have high levels of vulnerability around addiction, poor mental health, or domestic abuse. And that's a huge number of children. We actually, when we found it, we thought it was almost too high a figure to be able to talk about. But, we've tested from all angles. So that immediately tells you of children who have got a bigger mountain to climb. But I think, in addition to those statistics, what we know now is that families are smaller, thinner, if you like, and longer. They're likely to include many more generations than they would have done in the past, but have fewer siblings in a family. Also, that means that, especially with them being more mobile, which we know they are, they're less likely to have access to extended family. So the units can be more isolated. And of course, more parents are likely to be working now. So again, all the issues about the real cramp on time and pressures really come to a head then. But family is absolutely the bedrock of a good childhood. And all families go through times where, they've got pressures, things aren't going right for any family all the time, and they need a bit of help. For some families, they will need a lot of help a lot of the time. And if we can get that support in there, my core belief is that most families can thrive and fly. But if we don't put that there, and we've seen massive reduction of resources over the last 15 years, then actually those problems endure, they escalate, and sometimes they'll come into crisis.
Actually, just picking up one of the things you said there, I was actually chatting to my mother-in-law over summer about exactly one of the points you made about the families being further apart from each other. So they used to live in closer proximity to each other and therefore got a lot of informal help from other family members in lots of different ways that actually matters quite a lot. And now families live further apart and therefore you're more reliant on things outside of your family, whether that be the government or friends or whatever, to provide some things. But just become one issue that we sort of start with at the top about income. And obviously income's not everything, money's not everything, but part of the government's opportunity mission is about tackling the idea that too many families are struggling to afford the essentials. And actually, the first 2 episodes we had, child poverty came up as an issue where some issues around child poverty are leaking into the education system. So, Christine, just how many families are having financial difficulties?
Yeah. So Helen, you told me to come with stats. So I've come with lots. I've come with lots of stats for this. There's a bunch of different ways that you can go about answering that question. One of the most common, or one that people tend to rely on a lot, is something called relative poverty. Now, it's the clue sort of in the name. Relative poverty is how this family is doing relative to the rest of the income distribution at the same time. And that's defined as having income below 60% of the median, so 60% of kind of the average person's income in the distribution. If we look at that measure, we see 4.5 million children, or 31%, are in relative poverty, and that's actually up from 27% in 2010. So that's a pretty big increase. This is really concentrated in especially larger families, and it also is something we often think of poverty as being, oh well, the parents should just work, but actually 23% of kids in working families are in relative poverty. So this is something that cuts across a lot of different groups. We can also then take a different tack and say, well, but maybe we know that the average income has been increasing over time and people can afford more. And so is it right? Is that the right measure? Do we want to keep pegging that to the average income? So one way around that is we can look at something called absolute poverty. And absolute poverty just fixes a line in the sand. And it fixes a line in the sand at 60% of the median income in 2010. So we're saying, at that point, if you come above that level from back then you're good to go. You're no longer in absolute poverty. On that, we see around a quarter of children are living in absolute poverty once housing costs are taken into account.
That's
a
one
quarter,
in four.
26% is huge. It's about 20% if you look at this before housing costs, because lower income families tend to get a little bit more support with their housing. Now, absolute poverty, because of how it's defined, it tends to fall over time because incomes tend to grow over time. One worrying thing is that actually in the last few years, particularly around the cost of living crisis, we saw that reverse. And so we started to see absolute poverty ticking up, which does speak to the idea that families, particularly lower income families, were feeling the pressure of that period of high inflation and prices going up quite quickly. But some people even say absolute poverty isn't the right measure to look at. And what we want to understand is, well, what does this look like on the ground? What does it look like in that house for that family? So a third way that we can go about answering that question is looking at something called material deprivation. And that's basically a question of what can this family afford? What do they have? What do they not have? If they don't have it, is it because they don't want it? Or is it because they say they can't afford to have it? And you get lots of different measures here, but there's a couple that really stood out to me. We see that around 28% of children were living in material deprivation, particularly after COVID. And that really shot up in the cost of living crisis post-COVID period. There have also been really big increases in the share of population with food insecurity. So it was about 6% in 2020. It's now 11% of children are living in households with food insecurity. 3% of children in 2020 lived in households that weren't able to heat their home. Now that's 11% again. There's some data quality questions, and this is a sort of bigger perennial issue of how do we measure stuff when we can't quite always trust the surveys. But on all of these measures, there are kind of warning signs coming up that particularly the last few years do seem to have been really hard for some families and do seem to have been kind of disproportionately hard for families at the bottom of the income distribution.
Anne, it sounds like a really obvious question, but when you see all these numbers around some families struggling with incomes, I guess it's not necessarily a family for all points in time, but some families have persistent problems, other families dip in and out of problems. I mean, what do you think that's actually meaning for children? What's the consequence of that for children's outcomes?
Well, it's really tough and it is far-reaching. Obviously, this is the obvious one. You can't buy as much for your kids as you'd like to. You can't take them to as many places that, you would like to. There's material things around the home they won't have, including holidays, including toys, including going to other kids' houses for birthday parties because you need to buy a present or having them back to yours, things like that. But there's something as well that I think kind of goes beyond that, which really undermines kids' confidence, if you like, and kind of confidence about the future and self-belief. It's that feeling that you're always looking at the emergency that is today. You're not planning for the future. You don't have faith that things are going to turn out all right. If you talk to a child in a family where things are going well and there's plenty of money, they'll be talking about where we're going on holiday next year. Shall we do this? Shall we do that? It's not like that for kids where there's no money in the household. There might not be any food at home in the cupboards when they get there. They might not, have the uniform they need to be able to go to school or the PE kit. Everything's about how do we get through today? And I think that really has a big impact in confidence of kids. Obviously, beyond that, there are all sorts of kind of outcomes that we can see where poverty has a massive impact. Absenteeism from school, mental health, educational achievement, all is linked to levels of poverty if you don't break it. And that's what the opportunity mission, of course, is all about.
I think that's really important to sort of say there's this material aspect and then there's this wider set of aspects and wider set of channels. Another one I would add to that is the impact that poverty has on parents and the impact that those parents then have on their kids.
Children know that. That's part of their holding back in asking for stuff because they know the parents are really under pressure. So they won't, ask parents to go places. They'll try and protect parents because they know they're already so stressed.
Well, I assume it's also the case that if you're a parent in this situation, you're just spending a lot of your mental energy too on budgeting and working out how to find the school uniform or how to get breakfast on the table or how to do something. And that's exhausting, right?
Yeah.
And therefore you have less energy to do other things that might be good for your child.
Yeah, there's some interesting evidence coming out of the US that kind of looks at this and at this, they call it the scarcity mindset of when you are nickel and diming every single decision. Some people, one analogy that somebody made that stuck with me is it's like living your life with your phone battery perpetually on like 5%, and you're just trying to get through the day. But every time you're taking that phone out and looking at it, you're making a judgment about, is this worth it? How long can I have? Is this next second? Is this next thing that I click on, is that going to be good enough? And that kind of, if you kind of write that and extrapolate that to living your life and eking out the family budget, what you see is that people under that kind of financial strain tend to make worse decisions, tend to be less able to kind of connect with their children and relax and have those positive interactions, but also just tend to struggle with, should I be having my kids sit down and do homework right now, or is it more important that we have dinner together as a family? And those decisions get really difficult when you're in that world of having to constantly decide every minute, every second what it is that you're going to do next.
And of course, the government has commitments on child poverty. I mean, if we took those seriously, Christine, what could they do about it?
So I've said this before on this podcast, poverty per se is actually a very easy, in some sense, an easy problem to solve, right? Because there's a lever that sits in Whitehall, which is called Give Families Money. And if you pull the Give Families Money lever, then you're going to see that poverty goes down. Now, it's probably not quite as easy as all of that. So this obviously was a big priority of the new Labour government in particular. But even with the focus that they put on increasing tax credits and boosting family incomes, they saw that relative poverty measure go down maybe about 6 percentage points, so sort of 33% to 27%. That's a big increase, but that's clearly not we're eradicating child poverty. But that being said, there are policies here that you could look at. The two-child limit is one that comes up quite often. The benefit cap would be another one. Family premium would be another one. So there's specific policies and specific aims where you could make a choice as a government to be more generous, to offer families more money. And in doing that, you would pretty directly have an impact on child poverty. There's then a separate question about if you care about the poverty measure per se, or if you care about the sort of wider outcomes that children face. And there, I think some of the evidence that's coming, particularly from the US, starts to become a little bit more challenging. So there's, I think there is a kind of clear causal link between give families money, relax some of those constraints, things get better, but it's smaller than people often think. And there are some really high quality randomized controlled trials in the US that give families really quite large amounts of money over really quite a long period of time and measure really quite a lot of outcomes and are not particularly finding big changes on any of those outcomes. So there's probably more to do to say, is that just because there's lots of small changes in lots of different ways on lots of individual outcomes rather than one big bang effect? But when we're looking at that evidence, I think for me, that makes me ask, we should think about poverty per se almost as a moral issue, or you could look at it in that way and take it in that way, but we should also think about the wider safety net and those kind of in-kind supports, or offering family hubs, or offering services, or offering vouchers, or there's a whole other set of tools, and we should keep an eye on those as well when we're thinking about mitigating the effects of growing up in poverty.
Yeah, and actually, one of the things we spoke about in some of the previous episodes as an example was about the rising levels of poor mental health as an example among children. And that doesn't seem to be it's not just a story of poverty. There are more children in more families that are having poor mental health even when they're not in poverty. So it's not as simple as just the money. Anne, again, you've thought about this for a very long time. What's your take on how important kind of income and cash is versus all the other things that governments and families do to try to support children?
So there's these two aspects, aren't there? There's the financial transfer, the giving the money, which is obviously money is really important. But then there's also the social context and the interventions that you can put into place that help both alleviate poverty in the here and now. And free school meals is one of those, which is most direct. It has an impact today. You've got a full belly and that helps you. And then also you focus on, the root causes, if you like. And, I have been a strong proponent of that as well, of those social context support measures you can put into place. Now, within that, if you look at all the impacts, the much more likely to be excluded from school, the fact that you've got a greater disadvantage gap in education, poor mental health, all of those interventions you can make lean in and prioritize the kids who need it most, which are usually the poorest kids. So you can do something straight away, which is you can make choices over how you implement what you're already doing to offer that extra support or do it in a way that makes them a priority. But then there's the family hubs and that kind of support where you can help and intervene really early to work with families to work out what's going on and if problems are arising and respond to those, but also start to work on those other issues like poor housing, like helping families look for work and build confidence and get back into work. And that kind of real pincer movement, and we saw it back in the Labour government back in 97, particularly around lone parent families and help for lone parent families through job centres and things like that, can really start to help children and their parents break that pattern and break those barriers between not having enough money or not having had enough money for a long period of time and being able to get those opportunities. And I think it is a long haul. This isn't something that's going to happen overnight. But from the outcomes from Sure Start that IFS did and the evaluations, you could see instantly in over a period of time with health, with education, and with those long-term outcomes for young people, if you have that kind of support in place from Sure Start centres and family hubs, we now have Best Start there, then you can see over a relatively short period of time, improvements in outcomes for children. And that's the kind of long-term kind of what I see as an infrastructure support we need to have in particular for those families.
And just picking up on that, Anne, I mean, obviously there's lots of different moving parts here, everything from the family hubs, the housing, the income and all that. But if you look across that kind of wide safety net that government's offering, do you think there are just problems across the board, or are there some bits of it that are just screaming out and you just think that's the bit we got to tackle first? That's the thing that's really making the biggest single difference?
Well, obviously, the two-cat limit is a big one in terms of changing those figures on child poverty. That would have an instant impact. We know during COVID, extra help for families and child benefit made a big difference there in terms of those families. It really made the difference between being able to think about what good food you can get and plan for the week and just getting by, that really moving into being able to slightly relax on some of those fronts. So those are absolutely essential. And also in terms of really being able to understand benefit caps and the importance of that, how we offer that important safety net at a level that is meaningful for families. And that's something which clearly is very stretched at the moment. So it has to be this, pincer approach across government. Looking back, of course, there was a poverty unit in the previous Labour government, which applied to all departments, was very connected to DWP, very connected to the Treasury, and looked at how every single policy could play its part. The big thing about that is it was driven by the Prime Minister. And I think that's what we really need to see here, that relentless drive from the PM about making this a priority across government.
Perhaps we'll come back to whether actually even if is there an opportunities mission anymore. I'm actually not sure. Maybe we'll come back to that. But just Christine, what's your take on how the wider sort of social network is holding up?
I think it's no secret that what we saw during the 2010s was an ambition to bring down spending on public services, cut back and actually withdraw or draw back from some of the programs that had been funding. I mean, Anne mentioned Sure Start. That was a really obvious example. We saw spending on Sure Start fall by over 2/3 from its peak in 2010. And that was a pretty active decision to say we're going to free up local governments so that they don't have to spend the money in this way anymore. And at the same time, we're really going to squeeze local government budgets so that they have less available, less that they could discretionarily put towards these kind of preventative services. That has also happened not just in the kind of Sure Start and early years space, but much more widely as well. If we look at local authority spending on the kind of whole of children's services, it's about £12 billion a year. So back where it was in 2009 after falling by about a sixth over the sort of intervening 15 years. But there's been an absolutely enormous change in the composition of that spending. So in 2009, about half of that budget was spent on safeguarding and children who are looked after, so children in the social care system. Those are non-negotiables. So if you're a local authority, like that, you have to do that by law. You don't get to flex and move around of like, oh, well, maybe we could just look after this child 3/4 of the year instead of the full. No, you have to do it. So that's non-negotiable. That non-negotiable spending that was about 50%, that's now 80%. And so that means that there's just an awful lot less left over for local governments to be able to make choices about prioritizing things like Sure Start or youth centres, which are where two of the categories where the biggest cuts have fallen, to be able to afford that rise on safeguarding spending up to 80% within the same kind of overall envelope.
Okay, so we've seen that families are changing. Children are less likely to live in homes with sort of two parents. They're less likely to live close to their extended families. That's adding some pressure. There's still large numbers of children in poverty. So there are clearly lots of issues there. What I'd like to zoom in on now, which is what I've become increasingly obsessed about, is really those children where the government is so worried about them that they decide they want to intervene through the social services system. And as I said at the top, I've just become obsessed with this statistic that 1 in 3 children have a referral to children's social care by the time they're 16. So I think that's the government saying we are sufficiently worried about something in the life of this child that we're going to step in and try to do something. 1 in 3. I mean, almost. I kind of can't get over it. So, perhaps first you can sort of tell us about what's happening in these cases. I mean, what is going on in a child's life where the government says we think we need to intervene, look more closely at what's happening here.
And I just should say as well, it's a pretty high barrier to get that kind of intervention. You've got to really get to the point where you're at immediate risk of harm to be able to get to those interventions in many cases.
So just pause on that. You think that the government thinks that 1 in 3 children at some point before the age of 16 are at risk of immediate harm, basically?
Well, harm you could use in terms of neglect as well. But we know, and a lot of Directorate of Children's Services from the northeast of England have said in the past that one of the greatest reasons for driving those numbers have been driven up is parents who are in adversity. So we're back to the point that families are stretched. They don't have the income they need, and the adversity is driving neglect or driving those children being in very difficult positions. Children who are being exploited is another thing that's absolutely boomed over recent years, sadly. All of these things where we've seen needs increased, and the COVID pandemic rocket boosted a lot of that. At the same time that support decreased so much, so you've seen halving of spending on prevention, a doubling of spending on crisis. And as we say, the numbers of kids who get help with crisis is tiny in comparison to the number who need help to prevent. And that's just an unsustainable, circle of doom that we're in, which, Josh McAllister in his review of children's social care said we have to break out of, we have to start preventing this. We have to start working with families to help those children stay with families rather than leave it to get to the point of crisis.
And can we just wallow a little bit longer in what the social services system really is? I think a lot of people, and I was one of them until recently, are sort of oblivious of this system. So sort of mechanically, what's happening? So you have children and something's going on in their home life, and it could be they're not getting enough to eat, or they don't look like they're clean enough, or they look like they are struggling emotionally because there's some kind of conflict going on at home. Or in the more severe cases, maybe they are themselves subjected to some kind of abuse. So there's the things happening, and somebody in society spots that and reports it, and then the government steps in and sends someone to your house, and then I guess it's anything from helping the parents out through to the child is taken away. I mean, is that what we're talking about here?
Yes, that's right. Importantly here, that contact with social services might be around early help. And so actually early help is what it says on the tin, ideally. Everything we've talked about, that kind of support through family hubs, everything around helping children around school, pastoral care, it can often be a combination of these things, which is there to help families get on their feet, help families be able to progress. and children with it. But then the more severe cases, of course, are where there are real concerns around the harm and the immediate harm to children. And then there'll be, case reviews and conferences where children may be taken into care. Now, we have seen a big increase of older children coming into care, which in itself has fueled an increase in the children's social care numbers. Often those will be children who the concern is around exploitation or gangs or being involved in violence. They often, as well, are the children who will cost the most for those social services to be able to provide that care. And of course, what that means is you've got less money once again for prevention. So, what the review on social care a couple of years ago that Josh McAllister led said, we have to reset this whole system. We have to get ahead. We have to put much more emphasis on family support and prevention. We have to look at kinship care in a real way in this country, which we haven't done, which is helping families and extended families often look after children if there are concerns. And we have to make sure that actual residential care and foster care, if children are coming into care, has the best quality care possible, and they're able to go back to their families positively as soon as possible.
I know, Anne, that you've written a lot before about the power of finding what you call reachable moments. So those times where public services or professional society spot children or young people who might be in trouble, and they do the intervention. I guess I'm interested in your take on, is the fact that the government is picking up a third of children at some point, does that mean we're finding lots of these reachable moments, or actually are there even more children out there? Is it even more shocking than this? Are there more children out there who just aren't being spotted?
Well, I think when, things aren't going well, when a referral goes to children's services, I mean, at its most baseline, there is a concern to be had if children are being referred. So ideally, what we want to do is get ahead to the point where we're helping with problems as they emerge, as they're spotted in the right way with families. Now, the biggest reachable moment is at the point of birth, when you have your child. Your whole life is filled with optimism about what you've got with your new baby, the life ahead of them, all of those things, which is why help and work with those families, health visitors, midwives, that early start for life around family hubs is that moment where for both the mother and the father, there's that optimism there. And when that is available at the kind of to the extent needed, and again, that's suffered with cutbacks over recent years, then really you're putting in place a really strong foundation to build upon. That is one. As children go throughout school, of course, school readiness, you've got children who are going into school, you've got teachers. Again, schools can help support and really boost that moment. And as you go through life, that real transition points. But we know that there's a big problem about children not reaching the developmental goals when they're going to school. Only 2/3 do. Government now has a new target that 3/4 should. But actually, for those children that are growing up in disadvantage in some way, we know that's nearer to half. So half of all kids, when they're growing up with disadvantages and mountains to climb in their life, aren't starting school to the point that we would hope they would. And of course, once they start school, then it's going to be much more difficult to get there, which is why the early years is so important.
Because we've talked lots in the series, it's a common theme coming up from this, Christine, right? That early intervention is really important, and there's a pretty big prize from getting that right.
There's a huge prize from getting it right. And I think, Anne mentioned the work that we'd done on Sure Start at IFS. And these children who had access during their first years of life to these Sure Start centres were significantly more likely to go on to get 5 good GCSEs when they were 16. They were significantly more likely to have fewer hospitalizations when they were teenagers. They were less absent. They had fewer special educational needs support plans in place. So there's a lot that goes on that you can get from that early intervention and from that prevention. And so something people kind of sometimes ask me is, well, why aren't we doing this? I think everyone kind of agrees. And if you talk to policymakers in this space, everyone will sit there and bang the drum that says, yes, we like prevention, we like early intervention. And yet it keeps not quite coming through. I think one part of that is that we have to accept that when we if we're going to get serious about making that transition, it's going to be expensive, particularly in the short term. And we see this, when we talked about special educational needs, and should we spend more on prevention and more on early intervention to try and reduce spending on EHCPs. We saw this when the government tried to push through its reforms on welfare spending. We saw this, that, they wanted to reform the system in a way that was going to better support people, draw down long-term costs. But to do that right, you're going to spend more in the short term because you still have to support all of those people with those high needs. You're just also trying to add preventative spending. So I think that's part of it. I think there is also a challenge here for the way that researchers have sometimes approached this question, because at least coming at this from an early years perspective, the number of times I was told, oh, we're just going to do early intervention, and if we only did prevention, think of all of the spending that we could save, think of the whole children's social care budget we wouldn't have to spend, think of all of these special educational needs support plans we wouldn't have to do, think of all of the youth justice spending we wouldn't have to do. And people would, add those numbers together and say, look, you're going to eliminate all of the budgets of all of these services if you just do prevention in the early years. And that's never going to be a realistic goal. There are always going to be children who need that early support and still need it to be followed up through their lives. There are going to be children who start off in a good place and maybe get good intervention, but something happens to them later in their lives and they fall off track and they need more support. And there's always going to be children who, early intervention and prevention can make their lives better and can reduce the amount of help that they need, but that they are still going to need that help on an ongoing basis. So I think part of this conversation also has to be being realistic about saying, yes, there's a fiscal prize here, probably, but there's also a question about what are the outcomes we really want to deliver, and being a little bit bolder, I think, in saying, no, actually, there's a political choice. We want these outcomes, and this is a really good way of doing this, which is probably going to save us some money, but is also going to save families and children a lot of grief.
I want to pick up just one thing that Anne mentioned earlier, which is about teenagers and the number of teenagers that are facing problems. And I know you established the Commission on Young Lives to try to develop a plan to protect vulnerable teenagers from exploitation. I mean, in a nutshell, what is going wrong there? And I guess more positively, what is it that needs to be done to make sure? I mean, we just talked about early intervention. Obviously, that's the first best thing to do. You intervene early, you stop these problems. But we can't ignore the fact that there are teenagers now with problems. What do we need to be doing for the teenagers?
I mean, the headlines tell us, remind us in terms of tragic consequences, what's happening with some teenagers, and certainly the number of teenagers who are falling out of school, they have poor mental health. It's almost like a blueprint that you can see and understand of how young people get to the point where they're involved in violence and crime. It's there, it's happening. But it doesn't have a home in government, or it hasn't had a home in government. It's something which some people have said, oh, well, when they get to teenage years, they're too old or they're too complicated, all these things. With the Commission on Eyes, we just wouldn't accept that. We really want to look at how, if you're going to rebuild a system or reset a system, it could lean in. It could lean in to give those kids the support they need. Now, that would mean there would be extra help for children to prevent them being excluded from school. Or if they're struggling in school, there'd be extra help to help boost that. It would mean that you provided more, activities and support when they're outside school. So they had places to go that were safe, with, positive relationships with youth workers that could help guide them and inspire them. And it would mean that you would help families as well, often families struggling themselves, to be able to provide that support for their children and help keep them safe. And we put forward that the centerpiece of that was a recommendation that there should be a Sure Start for teenagers, or the equivalent, which is now actually, when in the manifesto of the government, is now being rolled out as Young Futures hubs for older children in the areas of greatest need, but with those providing great things with support, the things that actually we would all want for our kids as teenagers, but making sure they're there in those areas of greatest need and providing the kind of help and inspiration that we know teenagers want, but so often haven't got over recent years.
So we should probably draw things to a close there, because I know we're heading up against time. I started this whole series with the question, are the kids okay? And listening to this discussion, it seems clear to me that for too many children, the answer is no, then they're not okay. And they're not all struggling in the same way. They have different issues going on in their family lives, but many of them are struggling, and the broader families are struggling. I'm really struck that every expert I've spoken to has emphasised the importance of early intervention in early life, and just this fact that everyone brings up that you take a child at 5, you look at how they're doing, and you can predict really pretty well how they'll be doing in 15, 20, 30 years' time. That is really pretty depressing. But it does emphasise this point that we have to try to intervene early to get these problems off, but also not ignore the fact that there are some children who've already missed early life. They're already in their teenage years, they're already struggling, and therefore we need all of those things, all those bits of government, all those different departments working together to try to make children's lives better. But for now, that brings us to the end of this episode and to the end of our main 4 parts of the series asking whether the kids are okay. We've now looked across early years, school years, after 16s, broader family life, and along the way we've had a huge amount of engagement from all of our listeners through emails, YouTube, comments, questions on Mumsnet and Spotify and lots of other places. So thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and taking part in the conversation. And we're not quite finished yet because early next week we're going to release a special Q&A episode where I'm going to put your questions to our resident expert Christine and some other guests that have joined us through the series. So watch out for that. In the meantime, if you have enjoyed these discussions, please do subscribe to the IFS Zooms In your podcast app and share the series with anyone you think might be interested, which hopefully is anyone. And if you'd like to support our work, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. You can just follow the link in the episode description. But for now, thank you to Christine, thank you to Anne, and thank you to all of you. We'll see you next time.